Hello. Not many people manage successfully to combine their personal interests with their work, but I suspect that my guest today has managed to do just that. His thirst for information, discovered in boyhood, has always stood him in very good stead in his career as a negotiator. Jimmy REID was born in a slum clearance house in Govan near Glasgow in 1932. He was one of 7 children, of whom only 4 survived infancy, Jimmy being the youngest. He grew up through the worst years of the Depression, but although his father was often out of work, his childhood memories are mostly of a closely knit community where family life was very important. It was always understood that he would leave school at 14, so formal education never meant very much to him. But his school years gave him a voracious appetite for reading, which has stayed with him ever since. Novels by Stevenson and Scott led him on to Shaw's writings, and then a developing interest in politics and current affairs, particularly on Clydeside. Although always a socialist in outlook, Jimmy REID's first serious job was with a Glasgow firm of stockbrokers. He proved he could be successful in this capitalist sphere, but at the same time he made no secret of the fact that his personal beliefs led him in the opposite direction. Eventually they led him out of stockbroking, and at 16 he became an engineering apprentice, the trade he has followed ever since, and he joined the Young Communist League. Wages for an engineering apprentice were very low indeed after the Second World War, and it wasn't long before the apprentices in Glasgow were leading the rest of Britain in an attempt to improve their situation. A walkout on Clydeside was followed by a spread of strike action into England, which eventually involved about 40,000 apprentices. Jimmy REID was active in the strike and in union affairs following the return to work. In 1952, he was elected chairman of the Young Communist League, and he became secretary of the Junior Workers' Council of the Amalgamated Engineering Union, just in time to complete his apprenticeship and be called up for national service in 1953. In the RAF, he was able to follow his other great interest, jazz, by playing the trumpet in a succession of RAF bands. Then, in 1955, he returned to his engineering job at British Polar Engines, where he very quickly became convener of shop stewards. During the next few years, apart from representing his members' interests, he also became active in improving the lot of old-age pensioners. He supported CND and was elected to the National Executive Council of the Communist Party in Britain. He married his wife Joan, and in due course his daughters Eileen, Shola and Julie were born. Then he moved to a new job at Aberclyde Shipbuilders, where he became AEU convener and one of the leaders of the work-in, which saved the 4 shipyards from closure in 1971. A year later, he became rector of Glasgow University. A man well used to treading the corridors of power, Jimmy REID finds time to be a very strong family man too. Jimmy REID. Welcome to the programme, Jimmy. I'm interested that so early in life you had decided that formal schooling wasn't for you. What did you so dislike about school?
Well, it did nothing to excite my imagination. In those days we had the 11 plus, which I'm very pleased to see has been dispensed with some years ago, because in those days one test could determine a child's future, which seems to me ridiculous because children develop at different stages, as we all know now, and so do people. And people that are not so bright at 11 might be remarkably bright at 15. Anyway, I passed my 11 plus, honestly, very, very well. I think we dropped 1.5 points out of 150, that kind of thing. So then they streamed me for Oxford and Cambridge. And they gave us Latin, French and Greek. And I wasn't going to Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, I was going nowhere but at 14 out of a job, out of school and into a job. I actually know no one in my street who stayed on at school. I mean, in those days, social circumstances had earmarked us to be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. Now, that's bad enough, but I found my secondary education was so structured and formality that my imagination just rejected it. And this is at a time, Harry, I can assure you, when I was, for some reason or other, I discovered books in which I was never out of the Elder Pat Library in Govan. So I was a voracious reader, and my mind was was wide open, just wanting to get interested in things, but I had to do it out of school.
Yeah. Because that's what I was going to say to you. I mean, there was no incentive in school for you to read these books. You came to them privately, as it were.
From the age of about 12 onwards, 12 to 14, or 11 and a half to 14, whatever it is, senior secondary school, I almost learned nothing at school. And yet, when I look back on it now, it was the formative years of my life because I learned a great deal outside of school. Ideas were opening up to me. This great treasure house of knowledge that's contained in books, I discovered that, and it had nothing to do with school.
Well, let me ask you this question, Jimmy. Here you are, you become famous for your writing apart from other things. You would almost say in spite of your formal education, and yet for years and years and years, we have gone about saying Scottish education is the best. How does that square with your experience?
Well, I think people that go around saying that, you know, are really talking about a historical fact. It's historically true that at one stage Scottish education probably led the world. I mean, the fact that we've got a national bard from 200 years ago who was a ploughman is testimony to the fact that in 200 years ago we had literate ploughmen. In the same time, the poets from England, for example, weren't ploughmen. They were Byron, who of course was born in Scotland. They were Shelley. In other words, they were the products, if you like, of the aristocracy. The reason why we have Burns as a national bard from 200 odd years ago is because we must have had the most literate population in the world. Now, how that came about, I don't know, Harry. I mean, I think it's something to do with the development of Christianity in Scotland, where, was it Knox that was talking about a school in every village and a college in every town. And also, I think, there was generated in Scotland 200 or 300 years ago a respect for the pursuit of knowledge and information as an end in itself, not as a means to a career, but the actual acquiring of knowledge and information and the exercise of reason as part of the kind of integrity of life. Now, that's a tradition in Scotland which hadn't died out in my childhood, but it almost died out within the official structures of education.
Yes, so
you follow me there?
Yes, I do follow that. Yes, and I see how you've come at this at your Scottish heritage, about which you write so perceptively. But in a sense, you saved yourself. How does a present generation of teachers and school help a whole lot of young people who had your experience, perhaps, but who haven't found the books and the readings and the heritage to take them forward? Education for its own sake, as you've just said.
Yeah. I think there's got to be a degree of inspiration in education. I've never found anyone that can communicate with me in a sense that alerts me, unless they're enthusiastic about the subject matter. And I think the tendency might be that teachers, for example, maybe teaching maths, have been teaching the same routine for donkey's years and so on. Maybe they get into such a routine that it's a bit boring for them. I think boredom with a subject on the part of the person who is to communicate is inescapably embedded in the consciousness of the person to whom he's supposed to be communicating. In other words, I really do believe that the teacher is probably the most important person in society. I think they should be substantially rewarded, but I think in return for that, we require from the teaching profession not just academic qualifications. I mean, I actually know a guy, I better not mention him, who's brilliantly qualified in terms of academic qualifications. He can't communicate. So he could probably walk into it. He has indeed he's got an important job in education. But I think an important job in education is the capacity to communicate. And all of these things I think I would ask for from my teachers, but particularly imagination. And also this concept that from an early age established that culture is not the abstraction of certain artistic pursuits from society at large. That culture is the anthropological concept of it, where we described the totality of a society as a culture. You know how they describe the economics, they describe the industry, they describe the technology, they describe the philosophy, they describe the jurisprudence, they describe its religions, and all the rest of it. That totality was a culture. And that, I think there's a way that you can generate excitement in people by this, again, the integrity, the integrality of people. And that's all lost in education. Things are abstracted. Mathematics should be taught relative to the physics and the physical world. Literature should be related to the struggles of mankind for enlightenment. Not read out bits of Shakespeare. You know, one and one is two.
Do you think that we have been too much concerned with bits of paper, certificates, certification, and assumed that that is education rather than what you've been talking about?
Oh, I'm absolutely convinced of that. I mean, let's face it, for a long period of time, education in this country consisted of stuffing a child's head full of information that they were expected to regurgitate during an examination. Now, what has that got to do with the exciting exercise of reason and deduction? And I think education also is intended, or should be intended, to give us the moral courage not only to draw conclusions, but to stand up for these conclusions, even if at a given moment of time they don't happen to be popular.
Well, on one occasion, of course, you showed that moral courage, indeed in a highly academic sphere, because in your 1972 rectorial address at the University of Glasgow, you talked about alienation, and that address, in fact, I think had wider coverage than any other rectorial address before or since. Do you feel that young people are still alienated from their society 10 years on?
Oh, absolutely. It's worse now. It's absolutely worse now. I see youngsters leaving school when they should be told, and legitimately so, that the world is their oyster, that the world is waiting for them to conquer it. And they're leaving school and they go to the labour exchange and society is telling them, well, we'll need to defer your conquering of the world because we don't want you. And the kids must feel, is it something to do with me? They might see it not as an inadequate society, but they might see it as a personal inadequacy. And I think we must inevitably be witnessing the demoralisation of youngsters. And then the unemployed youngsters become unemployable. And then they look forward to a future which is diabolically bleak. Now, in my opinion, that inevitably leads to a problem of alienation in a scale and a scope that we've never seen in this country. See, I actually grew up in social circumstances where poverty was more severe than our present generation of youngsters experience. But when I left school at 14, no qualification, I got down to the labour exchange. They says, what do you want to be? I mean, that time, and they says, well, you're not old enough to start an apprenticeship, so we'll put you here, stockbrokers. That's how I got into the stock exchange. I could have stayed there, by the way, although I'm glad I left.
That's one of the ironies of your life.
Well, but you know what I mean, Harry? Honestly, in my generation, some guys say, these kids, you know, they're being spoiled. I mean, how one-sided this is. My generation could really pick. When you were 16 years of age, you could say, they would ask you, you want to be an electrician, you want to be an engineer, you want to be a boiler maker? Now, that's the truth. That's not available to our youngsters.
You, of course, have always in your life seen the solution through socialist policies. And indeed, in one of your piece of writings, you refer to the higher philosophy that is communism. How did you come to join the Communist Party initially?
Well, I think there's two aspects of this. There are two aspects of communism which is insufficiently appreciated. I think there's a historic communism. It's an imagery of human brotherhood that goes back almost to the early misty days of man in this planet. I mean, the Garden of Eden. It's not only in Christianity, but it's in other religion, this concept of an ideal world, free of evil. Intrinsic to it is a love of each other. And then somewhere along the line, this is lost, and man has become divided, and we have slavery and all the rest of it. And a constant feature of history has been how men yearn for the golden age. And then the poets all write about the golden age, wasn't it? It was Milton's Paradise Lost. It was Robert Burns where he says, the golden age will then revive, each man shall be a brother. In harmony we all shall live until this earth together. All of this historic communism that's in the early Christian prophets and the early Christian pioneers, if you like. And this is a constant factor, recurring theme in mankind. And it really is. I mean, all these guys were the first socialists, were the first communists. So that's the historic communism. That's tremendously attractive. It's been down through the centuries. And in my youth, and even to this day, the ideas, the concepts of brotherhood, as opposed to fratricidal struggles between man or womankind as well. Now, that's tremendously attractive to me.
That's an idealistic concept,
yes,
isn't
I know,
it?
I know. In the 19th century, then we had Marx, who was saying, for previous centuries, we've only dreamed about these relationships, but now capitalism is creating a force of the industrial working class that can make a reality of these dreams. Right now, that's the background in which I get tremendously stimulated. So, please then see what happens. In addition to historic communism, there's a modern communist movement, and this is where I think all the things began to fall apart. The modern communist movement was based on the ideas of alienated intellectuals in Tsarist Russia who had no experience of democracy, in fact had a kind of contempt for democracy, and also were elitist. They were going to lead the blind masses to the socialist Valhalla. And so modern communism became a political structure of outrageous elitism. And everywhere where it's got into power, instead of introducing the millennium, it's created an elite that then became repressive, that then demanded conformity, that started persecuting dissidents. And so you've got the historic communism is still a dynamic appeal to people. The modern communist movement, in my opinion, has been a gross betrayal of historic communism.
But Jimmy, surely that was known when you joined the Communist Party. I mean, you
Yes.
speak very waspishly almost against that development in communism now. But that was known when you joined it. What attracted you then?
But the historic communism, I didn't believe the things they were saying, about, for example, about the Soviet Union. I thought it was all capitalist propaganda. And then when Khrushchev says, but it was true, then I say to myself, well, at least he's exposed it. It was an aberration. It was something that they've exposed and therefore they will rectify. And then as time went on, I'm saying we'll no longer have Stalinists. But every 2 or 3 years, I didn't mind the old Stalinists, but a new generation of Stalinists was coming up. And then I've got to ask myself the question, Harry. Stalinism is not an aberration, but was the natural byproduct of the philosophy. Now, when I come to that conclusion, if you're an honest man, you've got to acknowledge it.
Let me ask
Very
you.
difficult, by the way. See, you stand up and say you're
Yes.
wrong in public. It's a very painful process.
You've continued in your socialist views, though you've left the Communist Party now. You now can take a pretty hard line against leftists. In
Yeah.
your writings, you've called them a fruit and nut case or a nutter and so on. Is that a case of a poacher turning gamekeeper?
No, I must confess this. Even when I was in the Communist Party, I always had a certain contempt's not the word, I suppose. Well, maybe it is. Disdain at any rate for what I call the super-duper lefts, who were never working class. It's socialist politics roosting amongst the middle class, the kind of ultra-leftism that I'm talking about here. You always found them, they were more revolutionary. I used to laugh at them anyway. You go to meetings and you get some guy who was a market analyst for a stockbroker getting up at a meeting and say, "Come, REID, I think we should have a general strike." I mean, that's how you get more Trotskyists in equity than you'll get in the Boilermakers. Because it's a middle-class phenomenon.
And
So I've
why
always
you
had a certain...
distrust militancy for the sake of militancy?
No, I distrust it because I think it disfigures socialism. The political spectrum is not lineal. It's circular. If you go so far to the left, by Einstein's theory of relativity, you end up rubbing shoulders with them in the far right. And for example, I believe that the hard left and the Labour Party are actually contributing towards the possibility of Mrs. Thatcher's government continuing in power, or Thatcherite Toryism continuing in power to the end of this century. So my critique of these people is not that they're militants, but they're stupid militants. It's not that they're left, but they're absurd lefts. And that's been a fairly constant thesis. I mean, during the UCS, for example, we had 1 or 2 Trotskyists in the yards, but you don't get many of them because, as I say, they're mostly, ultra-leftism is a middle-class phenomenon. But, I mean, I had to deal with them at a mass meeting. And I've never taken them seriously. I kind of have tended to joke about ultra-leftism. But I'm afraid in some parts of the Labour movement in and around London, it's not possible to do that because they're quite a serious force.
Why did you win in the UCS and the miners, for example, have lost?
Well, I think, first of all, in the UCS, we won because we won public opinion. We won because we articulated our case in terms well beyond the Labour movement. I mean, I used to say to guys, go on to television, do what you want, but don't speak to please me or trade union activists or trade union militants. go onto that television and think of that wee lovely woman that maybe live in Morningside or live in a middle-class suburb of Glasgow, and she's a smashing wee woman, and she's voted Tory all her life because she thinks that's a respectable thing to do. But she's a lovely wee woman. Try and open her mind. Try and plant a seed in her mind about the possibility that our cause may be right. Now, I've got to say this. Everything we did, during the UCS, we had a militant struggle going on for 14 months. There wasn't one arrest. We wouldn't allow anybody to commit one act of violence. I mean, we sacked people who were violent. We sacked them, not the management. The workers sacked them because we said you cannot render undignified the cause of the working people, which must always be dignified. We will not do it. We who are the custodians in this struggle of working class dignity will not allow you, any violent person, to undignify our struggle. Now, I think at the end of the day, in modern society, industrial struggles will be won to the extent to which they can persuade the majority of our fellow citizens that those in struggle are correct. Now, I don't think not the miners, I don't think the leadership of the NUM even made an attempt to do that. I mean, apart from being undemocratic when they didn't call the ballot. So right from the start, I've got to please say this, not lately. In March of '84, I almost pleaded with the NUM publicly in an article. Please, if you don't have a ballot, you're going to turn miner against miner, you're going to split the union, you're going to make it impossible for other people to support you. In other words, you're going to lead the miners and the miners' union to disaster. That was the voice of a friend of the miners, not an enemy. And I was critical because experience has taught me that democracy is not a luxury inside the Labour movement, but an absolutely fundamental.
When you came back to UCS, you said you wanted to talk with Christians.
Yeah.
Why was that to be important for you at that time?
Because it's always been important for me. I actually love the New Testament, and I love the morality and the ethics that are expounded in the New Testament. And my only criticism of Christians is that they're not good enough Christians, that I would like them. I mean, to some extent, Christ has been as unfortunate in his adherence as Marx is with his. And really, I have always recognised the tremendous enervating force of the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Now, I'm not talking about any church here, because I think it's appalling how Christianity has been fragmentised into warring sections, all arguing that they've got a hotline to Jesus, and therefore they know. I mean, really, it's a load of nonsense, in my opinion. So, but the basics of Christianity, I espouse as a tremendous guide to life, not death, but to life.
There's a lot in your book, in both these books, in fact, about spirituality. And I wondered if perhaps in middle years you were moving back towards a religious view of life, or is that too much to read into it? No,
I don't think that's true. But I've always recognised there is a spiritual dimension to human beings. I mean, does it come from the development of our intellect and our consciousness? So that we have human beings that will die for mankind. Die for mankind, die for what they consider to be the best interests of mankind. You might get a rat dying for its family, but you don't have a philosophical statement for a rat. I'm prepared to die for rat kind. I don't think it thinks in these terms. So there's a tremendous dimension. I've known this. I mean, from people. I mean, from early Christians, from early socialists, from early trade unionists, from early libertarians, from early Democrats, they've all been prepared to sacrifice. That is a spiritual dimension. Call it what you like. I like to call it a spiritual dimension. Whether it emanates from God, whether it emanates from the goodness of man who's become this animal who can exercise conscience, I don't know. At the end of the day, I recognise it as a fact. I mean, a good man is a good man, whether he thinks he derives his goodness from a love of mankind or whether he thinks he derives his goodness from a love of God. And I don't particularly fancy the idea of a God, anyway, who doesn't inspire a love of mankind.
Jimmy Reid, democratic socialist and philosopher. Thank you.
Nice being here.